So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to concert 3 of the Oxford May Music Festival. I apologise if it's a bit more crowded than usual. In principle, we've sold out. The last time we did that in May Music was when Brian Cox gave a lecture, so I'm very happy to be in the same category as Brian. I wish I was getting the same fee. So this is essentially a dual-purpose event. It's not only hopefully an entertaining lecture with some great music, but also the launch of my book, more about which later, which grew out of many things that Jack Liebeck and I did together, starting in 2004, heavens above. It's almost taken me that long to write the book, but not quite. So basically this is a slightly different, this isn't the first time we've talked about Einstein and music in Oxford May Music. It must be probably the 4th. But this is a rather different one. It will concentrate much more on Einstein's personal qualities. And basically what I will do is to look at 3 things in some detail, mostly not physics, although the central section is about physics. So the first is Einstein's relationships with women, and that isn't supposed to be a prurient discussion, although it's quite racy. But it's really, I think, to counter the idea which is floating around for many people that somehow Einstein was autistic. Well, he was about as autistic as I am. And we'll illustrate that by looking at his long-term relationships with almost innumerable women. And then I want to look for a change, not at Einstein's early career in physics, which the foundation of special relativity and similar things, but rather at the latter half, most of which he spent in a bit of a dead end. And I want to just examine that for a while and discuss how that might have happened, but nevertheless how it might in the end turn out to be even more important, possibly, than the work he did in the first half of his career. And then finally, and of course throughout, because we'll have musical interludes, then we want to discuss Einstein's life in music, his various different things which he did in music, and how that interacted with his science and the rest of his life. So we'll illustrate the event with music, and we'll begin with some of his favorite music. Johann Sebastian Bach was arguably his favorite musician. It's a close second to Mozart. I think probably Mozart was his favorite, but Bach came a close second. And he played Bach all of his life, and he even played what Jack is going to play now, the Chaconne from the D minor Partita, possibly the pinnacle of the solo violin repertoire. So Jack, over to you. So I said that Einstein played that piece. He didn't play it anything nearly as well as Jack played it. But he was very careful never to let himself be recorded, so we don't have any recording of him playing the violin, but he certainly wasn't at that standard. So let me move on to the first of my major topics, which is Einstein's relationships with women. At the age of about 16, he left home. He ran away, in fact, from school. He hated his school in Munich. His father, whose electrical engineering business failed continually, had tried his hand away from Germany and moved to Italy, to Pavia. This is a photograph of the house in which they lived. Although they were perpetually in financial crisis, it never seemed to be serious. This was a palatial residence in the center of Pavia, which was built in the 15th century. So somehow they were short of money, but there was always money there. So he fell in love for the first time in Pavia. This is the Ponte Capelto, a very famous bridge built in 1354 in Pavia. Einstein met his first girlfriend when he was in the river. Now, he always said throughout his life that he couldn't swim. So unless, I don't quite know what he was doing in the river, paddling or floating or who knows what. But anyway, he met a girl called Ernestina Marangoni, who was 19 years old at the time. And they became inseparable for that summer, playing music together. She played the piano and he the violin. And he wrote his second paper, which sadly was never published, and he gave it to Ernestina, and it was lost. So we don't know, we know what the title was, but we don't know what it contained. It was about electricity and the electrical current. So he had a very passionate relationship with Ernestina. There is Einstein a year later from when he first met Ernestina. You see the beginning of his moustache here. And here is Ernestina. I apologize for the quality of the paper. She's here. And it's very difficult to get decent photographs of these people. So they were together for 6 or 7 months, and then they kept in touch for several years afterwards. But that was, I think, certainly, we can't be absolutely certain that they were in love, but it seems extremely likely. One thing we are certain of is that his next romantic involvement was with Marie Winterler, who's down here on the bottom left of the picture. You can almost, I think, tell from that picture that she was a very pretty woman. And indeed, Einstein was besotted with her. They became friendly because he lived in the house of her parents, Jost Winterler, who was a teacher at the Aarau school, and her mother, who was very tragically shot by one of her sons, who went insane after having traveled to America and brought back a gun. Some things never change. So that actually tragic event, which happened in about 1903, brought Einstein and Marie together again. They'd been certainly girlfriend and boyfriend for at least a year before Einstein left Aarau and went to university. The ETH, as it became, though it was then called the Polytechnicum in Zurich. And it was thought for many years that had been the end of their relationship, that essentially she and Einstein had drifted apart. They never had very much in common, but it turns out that was actually completely wrong. And we'll see a little bit about that. So, nevertheless, having ostensibly finished his relationship with Marie, he fell in love, with his first wife, Mileva Maric, who was a physics student, an extraordinarily rare event in those days, and not much less rare these days, sadly. He was the only woman in his class. There were only 5 of them, or was it 6 in the entire class. They often talked about physics, and they worked together late at night. And other things began to happen. So Mileva became pregnant. In the spring of 1901, she left. They were not married. She left and returned to her home in Novi Sad, which is now in Serbia. And in January 1902, she had a girl called Liesl. We don't know what happened to this girl, Liesl. She drops out of history. She never lived with Mileva and Einstein when they got married subsequently. And the theory is that it would have been too much of a scandal for Albert to have had an illegitimate daughter, and he at that stage didn't have a permanent job. So the idea is that either she died early, as many babies did in those days, or she was put out for adoption. The feeling is it's more likely that she died, probably of scarlet fever. Mileva was a musician, but unfortunately not a very good one. So she played the piano, but there's no record of her and Einstein playing together, which is very sad because their marriage fell apart rather rapidly. And one thinks, given Einstein's obsession with music, that it might have lasted somewhat longer had they been able to play together. Here is Einstein's flat in the Kramgasse. This is now the Einstein house in Bern. This is where some of his greatest papers were written, including Special Relativity. And here is Mileva with their two children, Albert, as they always called him, but obviously he didn't want to be confused with his father in later life, so he took the name Hans Albert. And Edward, who was never called Edward, was always called Tete or Tetel. As we'll see, but well, only very briefly, the second boy, Albert, became an engineer, a very successful academic engineer, obviously in the shadow of his father, but nevertheless had a very sheltered and very thoughtful and useful life. Edward sadly developed various mental health problems, was in and out of mental institutions for most of the latter part of his life. And this is the last photograph taken of Einstein with his son. He was a very gifted pianist before he developed his mental problems. This was just on the cusp of him going into an institution, and the last picture taken of them in 1932, when Einstein, you can just see him holding his violin, and Edward looking at the score of the piece that they were playing. So his family life was sadly rather tragic. He and Mileva's marriage disintegrated very rapidly. And one of the reasons it disintegrated was our old friend Marie Winterler. Astonishingly to many Einstein scholars, about 4 years ago, letters were discovered from Marie and Einstein, which dated back to the summer of 1909, 10 or more years after they'd last been romantically involved. And it's clear that this was a very passionate affair that lasted for about a year. And it's interesting quite why it eventually fell apart. It's very difficult to be sure. The documentary evidence is very sparse. Indeed, most of the letters which emerged had been torn up by Marie and had to be pieced together piece by piece. But nevertheless, it's clear that they had a very passionate affair, and that Einstein, in fact, wished to run away with Marie and leave Mileva and get married to Marie eventually. Unfortunately, it turned out that Mileva became pregnant almost exactly at this time, and it was, I think, clear that Marie refused the idea that Einstein should run away with her just when he was having a baby with his real wife. So I think there's no doubt, if you read the letters, how passionate they are. This was really Einstein's love of his life, and it's astonishing that we knew nothing about it, really, until a few years ago. Inside Marie's family, she married shortly after her affair with Einstein and had children. Inside Marie's family, it was always rumoured that her elder son was in fact Einstein's. And there is her elder son, Paul Albert. And here is Einstein at the same age, so you can see if there's any family resemblance. This is Einstein's cousins, the Bandy brothers. Their father was killed, was the man who killed the mother of Marie. It's very complicated. You can see a family resemblance there. This is Paul's brother. There's not much of a family resemblance there. Is there a family resemblance here? Who knows? Unless there's some DNA evidence taken, we'll never know whether or not this was in fact Einstein's son. This isn't the whole of the story. It gets so complicated, it reads like an Agatha Christie novel. At the same time as he was having an affair with Marie, he was accused of having an affair with another woman who also had a girl who was also rumoured to be Einstein's. But I haven't got time to go into all of that. So after Einstein's marriage broke up for all these various complications, he went back to a cousin who he'd known in his childhood. She had married, but then divorced and had 2 children. Here she is, Elsa Einstein, about the time when they reconnected in 1912. She was, as I said, Einstein's cousin through the mother's side. and he re-established a relationship with her when he started to visit Berlin, and eventually they lived together for a considerable time before eventually getting married. But before they got married, her daughter and Einstein began to have a relationship, and at one point, you wouldn't believe half of this, would you? But it's all true. He actually sort of proposed to Ilse, even though her mother was expecting to marry Einstein. So Ilse wrote a letter to a friend saying, you know, what am I to do? Einstein wants to marry me, but I think of him more as a father. As I said, beggars belief almost, but it's all documented and it's all to be read in my book and elsewhere, of course. So eventually he decided to marry the mother rather than the daughter. And they got married in 1919. That wasn't the end of Einstein's marital misconduct. In fact, it just was the start of the second phase. Einstein didn't believe in marriage as an institution. He absolutely didn't believe it. He thought it was invented by idiots. And he fell in love with his secretary. This again was a very passionate relationship. Some of the others, and most of the rest I'll talk about were not, I think, Einstein being in love. It was just Einstein enjoying the company of pretty women. But this one was another very serious one. His secretary. If any of you have seen the American series called Genius, it begins with a rather risque scene with Einstein and his secretary, which when I first saw it, I thought must be completely made up and completely out of the question, but in fact it's correct. I don't know if all the details are correct, but certainly Einstein had a very romantic relationship with this secretary. And he sent her this, he often sent sketches of himself, this is by some famous artist, and he wrote a poem on this one saying she was sent from God and he'll never forget her. And this was eventually, he realized this wasn't going to work. He proposed that he, Betty, and Elsa, his wife, should have a ménage à trois. They should flee to America and live together as a triplet, if that's the right word. But Betty had more sense than to accept that. And so they eventually broke up. This is a section of the letter that Einstein wrote to her breaking up, in which, let me translate it for you. However, I'm an old duffer who has to accept the facts as they are and look in the stars for what is forbidden to me on earth, which is a phrase he used almost exactly word for word when he broke up with his previous girlfriend back in 1910. And this was in 1923. So I don't know whether that was a Freudian slip or anyway, he used the same phrase. So the list continues. It's getting a bit dull, so let's not go through all of them. Greta Liebeck was a friend going back 15 years who survived Einstein's wife, who died in 1937. Unfortunately, she was a very sympathetic character, and I think Einstein was trying very hard to get her out of Austria in 1937. Obviously, the Nazis had just taken over, and he'd got as far as getting her a visa, but unfortunately, she died of cancer before she would leave. But Einstein brought out her husband and son, and as he did for thousands, literally thousands of people, he brought out of Germany and Austria and saved their lives. So a remarkable story, which is not often told. Another woman he had a relationship with, Margarita Kornikova, who was certainly a Russian spy. She was sent to look at the secrets of the atomic bomb project. Of course, Einstein knew nothing whatever about that. He was a security risk, so he wasn't told anything about that at all. But nevertheless, the Russians didn't know that, and she was supposed to be spying on Einstein. So anyway, they had a relationship until she was recalled to the Soviet Union in 1948. And then the last woman in Einstein's life, you'll be probably pleased to hear, was Johanna Fantova, who was a librarian near Princeton, not in Princeton itself. And there she is with Einstein in a boat. He was a very keen sailor, as you can tell from both of these pictures taken on boats. He never invited his wives to sail with him, only his other friends. But this is the most important woman to Einstein, his sister, Maja, who was born in 1899. There she is in her youth. She got a doctorate in German literature. But was very ill towards the latter part of her life and was stranded essentially in the US when she fled Mussolini's regime in Italy. This is one of the last pictures taken of her in Einstein's veranda. Einstein was devoted to her, and in her final illness, when she was bedbound, he read to her for at least an hour every night. And among the books he read to her was Tristram Shandy by Stern, which of course was written in 1760 something or other. Actually, he wrote it for over 10 years, almost as long as I took to write my book. And there's a quote in there which I came across the last time I read it, which astonished me. And Einstein read this aloud to Madja, and I often wonder what he thought when he came to this quote. So this is a quote by Stern, written in 1760. "Pray can you tell me, this is without anger, before I write my chapter upon straight lines, by what mistake, who told them so, or how has it come to pass that your men of wit and genius have all along confounded this line with the line of gravitation?" So clearly Stern realized that space and time were curved 200 years before Einstein discovered it. So enough of Einstein's relationships with women. I think I've given you enough information so it's absolutely clear that he had normal relationships with women and with men, though I've not had time to talk about them. And that the idea that he was somehow emotionally stilted is complete nonsense. So now we move to another, first of all, to some quite amusing movements of pianos and things, because the difficulty of having a front projection is that things get in the way. So now we'll move to a musical interlude by a composer with whom Einstein was friendly and whose work he greatly admired. He didn't, generally speaking, like modern music, but nevertheless he was very fond of Bloch, and Bloch he said about Bloch, "I esteem the works of Ernest Bloch above those of any contemporary composer known to me, and my knowledge of modern music is very restricted, but in one respect I feel certain. True art is characterized by an irresistible urge in the creative artist. I can feel this urge in Ernest Bloch's work as in few later musicians." So Einstein was chairman or honorary president of the Ernest Bloch Society. There you see his name up here. Honorary president, Professor Albert Einstein. The Ernest Bloch Society is still going, and I'm a vice president. This is my only musical qualification that I'm aware of, other than grade 5 theory. But nevertheless, I checked, and I'm still a vice president. So I think they asked me because they wanted someone who was vaguely related to Einstein, but I'm very vaguely related to Einstein. So now my colleagues are going to play some Bloch music, the piano trio. So now I want to move to my second area of interest, which is physics. And I want to look at Einstein's greatest achievement, which is the formulation of general relativity, and what that meant for the rest of his career, and what indeed it means for us today. So he formulated general relativity at the end of a very tortuous process which lasted for more than 8 years. He recalled already in 1907 that I was sitting in a chair in the patent office in Bern when all of a sudden I was struck by a thought. If a person falls freely, he will certainly not feel his own weight. I was startled. This simple thought made a deep impression on me. My excitement motivated me to develop a new theory of gravitation. So he began general relativity while he was in Prague, but he realized quite quickly that his mathematical knowledge and ability was unequal to describing what he'd already realized was a curved space-time. It happened that he was recruited back to Zurich in 1912, and this was very fortunate for him because he teamed up with his old friend Marcel Grossmann, who was a great expert in many branches of mathematics, and with whom he'd been a student. And here is their graduation marks. Grossmann there, I don't know whether you can read this, is in the middle. And it's ordered by mark, total mark, and here is Einstein. So Grossmann was well above Einstein in his average mark. And below Einstein is Marich, Einstein's wife, who sadly didn't graduate, didn't get a high enough score, not unrelated probably to the fact that directly afterwards she became pregnant. Anyway, she never became a physics teacher, which was a great sadness, both to her and to Einstein. On the right-hand side is the details of Einstein's Zeugnis, his terminal sheet, which you can look at on copies of this. So after he got back to working with Grossmann, they labored for 2 years, and eventually Einstein became very fluent in manipulating tensors, which is the mathematical entity you require to sensibly look at curved space-times. And in 1913, they thought they'd solved the problem of gravity, and they called it the Entwurf theorem. Entwurf means draft or sketch. So that was where they got to, but Einstein was trying to work out what the implications of this theory were, and one of the things which had been motivating people to look at a theory of gravity which was beyond Newton was the fact that the orbit of Mercury could not be predicted in Newtonian theory. The perihelion, the way in which the maximum advances, was not predicted in Newton's theory, but it should be predictable in a more general theory, and indeed he and his friend Michele Besso, who he met when he was at ETH, here he is, Besso. Besso was a remarkable man. He could actually work at the same level as Einstein, even though he was really a lawyer. But some of his joint work with Einstein in terms of mathematical manipulations is far beyond anything I could do. So he really was a remarkable man, an amateur physicist, a very, very rare phenomenon. Anyway, they used the Entwurf theory to calculate the perihelion advance of Mercury, and they got the wrong answer. So Einstein spent the next year or so essentially producing epicycles like Ptolemy's work, trying to make this thing work properly. And eventually, when he got to 1915, he realized that, in fact, Entwurf was wrong. It was the wrong theory. And going back in his notebooks, he returned to an idea which he'd wrongly discarded for various reasons several years before. And it was that idea that eventually became the theory of general relativity, which he elucidated in 4 lectures at the Berlin Academy in November of 1915. He was still working on it as he went. He corrected something in the 3rd lecture that he'd said in the 2nd lecture. So it was work in progress, but eventually he published it all, and it became accepted as our understanding of how gravity works. Einstein was notoriously unreliable in terms of remembering what he'd done and why he'd done it. And in particular, he convinced himself of something which scholarly research, looking at his notebooks and how they develop, and the various other documents that he produced, show that when he was trying to work out general relativity, he had 2 different approaches. The first was sort of based on physics, based on physical intuition, the intuition which had brought him all of the successes and great achievements of his early years in 1905, etc. He was a par excellence, a physicist who understood what nature was trying to tell him. But then another mechanism that he used in his work on general relativity was essentially mathematical, based on manipulating tensors to give a very simple formula that had clear symmetry. It turns out that if you look, as I said, these scholars who've looked at this show that in fact what he did to get to the final theory of relativity was to use a mixture of 1 and 2. So it turns out more physical intuition than mathematical manipulation. But Einstein convinced himself over the next few years that in fact he'd only used 2, that only he'd used mathematics. And this had very serious consequences for his later career. In a lecture in Oxford in 1933, the Spencer lecture, he said, "Our experience up to date justifies us in feeling sure that in nature is actualized the ideal of mathematical simplicity. It is my conviction that pure mathematical construction enables us to discover the concepts and the laws connecting them, which give us the key to the understanding of the phenomena of nature." So he's saying he believes pure mathematical speculation is how you solve the universe. And it's astonishing if you go back to things he wrote in 1905, he had exactly the opposite viewpoint, that mathematical construction and simulation was a complete waste of time. So that shows how one's ideas can develop over the years. And this idea that he elucidated in the Spencer lecture came from his recollection of how he'd solved relativity, general relativity, which in fact history shows was not correct. So for the rest of his life almost, he became increasingly concentrated on trying to unify electromagnetism and gravity. And that was not unreasonable. Those two forces were the only forces that were known in physics. And the fundamental laws of electromagnetism, which are expressed in Maxwell's equations, can be expressed beautifully in the same tensor notation as general relativity. So it seems logical that you ought to be able to find a way to explain them with the same theory. And there'd been a successful example, after all. Maxwell's equations are the unification of two apparently separate forces, that of electricity and that of magnetism. So it was not a stupid thing for Einstein to try and do. But it turned out that so many things were unknown. When he was working on this, the proton and the electron were thought to be the only charged particles, but they had enormous difference in mass. So why should it be that a negative charge should be so much different to a positive charge? And there were many theories over the years trying to explain why this was, before the discovery of the positron, the anti-particle of the electron, which of course has identically the same mass. So people just didn't know enough to really be able to do work which had a chance of unifying various parts of the theory. And in fact, the proton, which they thought was the other elementary electrical charge, isn't an elementary particle at all. It's composed of quarks and gluons and has a very complicated structure, which I've spent 25 years of my life trying to understand. So one problem of Einstein's unified theories was that they also tended to change general relativity. It was very difficult to take general relativity and leave it untouched. If you wanted to amalgamate electromagnetism inside it, you had to change it. And once you changed it, you tended to change its predictions. And then another problem was that as became increasingly obvious as the years went by, other interactions must exist. So the neutron was discovered. What was it that made a neutron decay, and why was some nuclei unstable? Why was radioactivity there? What was the force that was making the nuclei unstable? Indeed, why was it stable at all when it, as far as they knew, was composed of protons and neutrons? Protons are positively charged, they repel each other. If there were not some other force holding them together, then all nuclei would be unstable and they would all disintegrate almost immediately. So why is it then that you have positive charges which fly away from each other? Here is a balloon which is then attracting the dipole of the water with electrical particles rubbed off the material onto the balloon. So there's the electromagnetic force, and the opposite of that, the repulsion of protons, would disintegrate the nucleus. So there must be some other forces that are holding it together, but Einstein completely ignored all of those forces. He just carried on working with electromagnetism and gravity. But that, again, was not necessarily wrong. There was no reason to imagine that a partial unification might not be possible, and indeed it is possible. Unfortunately, it's not between the forces that Einstein was trying to unify. It's between the weak force, the force responsible for radioactivity, and electromagnetism. Those are unified, And that's the basis for today's standard model of particle physics. But we're still trying to unify gravity and the other forces, and obviously Einstein failed. One problem with all these unified theories was, as I said, they tended to modify general relativity. But general relativity is an astonishingly successful theory. The discovery of gravitational waves, one of the most beautiful things in physics, which Einstein, I should say, changed his mind about at least 3 times. First of all, deciding it did exist, then deciding that it didn't exist, and then changing his mind yet again. Anyway, they do exist, and they were discovered by the people including Barry Barish, an old friend of mine, and that is one of the most beautiful discoveries of the 21st century. And it turns out that if you look at the merging of 2 black holes, they produce a gravitational wave, which you can, that's the waveform which they produce. You can convert that into sound, which is what is done here. But then you can compare that waveform of the radiation as the black holes merge with each other with Einstein's theory of general relativity. And that's the solid line shown here, which you can't really see because it almost exactly fits what you see from the data. It's astonishingly good fit. And this is one of the most extraordinary events in the universe, 2 black holes merging. If we look at the theory of particle physics where we have strong interactions, we run out of steam almost immediately as soon as the reactions become strong, whereas Einstein's theory of general relativity is extraordinarily predictive. It's quite amazing. And if you want my personal opinion, I think it tells us something very, very important about future theories of particle physics and astronomy. There must be something deeply fundamentally correct about general relativity. A lot of the stuff that we've been doing in particle physics based on superstrings and similar theories started from quantum mechanics. And perhaps we need instead to start from general relativity, given that it's so successful, which of course was what Einstein tried to do, but he failed. So now for another musical interlude, and this time another one of composers with whom Einstein was rather friendly. This is Bohuslav Martinu, who lived, like Einstein, in Princeton for a while. He was in exile from the Nazis in the Second World War. He arrived in the US in 1941 as the Germans pushed into France. And from 1948 to 51 was professor of composition at Princeton. So Martinu and Einstein knew each other, and Martinu became fascinated by Einstein's work. Indeed, he became fascinated by The Evolution of Physics, which was a book which Einstein wrote with Infeld, one of Einstein's most famous books. And here is Einstein's dedicated copy to Martinu, to Mr. Martinu from Einstein, December 1943. And here is the piece which, in return, if you like, Martinu wrote for Einstein. 5 Madrigal stanzas, they're dedicated to Albert Einstein from Martinu. And Jack and Katya will play a selection of those 5 Madrigal stanzas. So Einstein apparently gave the first performance of that with Gabi Casadasu, who was a very well-known, originally French, but then fled, like Einstein, to the US during the war. So you get an impression of how good a violinist he was. He was really a good amateur, but not a professional. So let me go back to the beginning. When Einstein went to school, he was an obsessive violinist. He played with anybody and everybody. Indeed, he was obsessive throughout his life. And in 1896, so he would have been 17, he assiduously practiced the Brahms G major sonata, which is, by the way, my favorite, in order to hear Joseph Joachim, who's shown on this picture here, with Pablo de Sarasate, two great violinists together, one at the beginning of his career and one at the end. So Joachim played in a concert in Aarau, extraordinary program. You can't read it all here, but there's all sorts of strange and wonderful things, very short pieces, generally speaking. But he did play the Brahms G major sonata in its entirety, and there was also a choral part to the concert, so it was all rather rich in a way which concerts tend not to be these days. So when he went to Zurich, he played often with anybody he could meet in the street, in fact. This is him in 1912 with a colleague of his from the university, Adolf Hurwitz, and not really conducting, he's just posing for the photograph, but nevertheless Einstein and his daughter are playing almost certainly Bach's double violin concerto, which was one of Einstein's favorite pieces. Then when he was in Berlin for almost 20 years until the Nazis took over, he was attracted there by Max Planck and Walter Ernest, and they made him head of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Physics. His musical life there was deepened by many friendships with scientist musicians. Max Planck himself was a very gifted musician, both a pianist, a composer, and a singer. And a typical evening of music making at Planck's house was recorded by another physicist, Lise Meitner, in a letter to Otto Hahn, in 1916, in the middle of the First World War. Last night, she said, I was at Planck's house. Einstein played the violin in two heavenly piano trios by Schubert and Beethoven. Max played the piano, his son Erwin the cello. Erwin was eventually executed by the Nazis in 1945 for his involvement in the Stauffenberg assassination attempt on Hitler. The picture is one of another very famous, in his youth, violinist called Boris Schwarz. He was a well-known prodigy and subsequently became leader of various important orchestras in the US, and also an academic who wrote many well-regarded books, including one on the great violinists, which is well worth reading. He reminisced afterwards on playing with Einstein and his father. This is his father, Schwarz's father, who was himself a distinguished concert pianist. So Schwarz wrote that Einstein's musical taste was refined and selective. Aside from Bach and Mozart, he loved to play the Baroque trio sonatas by Vivaldi, Corelli, Handel, Purcell, Telemann, and many others. I remember that we alternated playing first and second violin. He was an experienced sight reader with a steady rhythm, excellent intonation, and a clear and pure tone using a minimum of vibrato. Another friend of Einstein was, again, in my view, the greatest violinist of the 20th century. My colleagues will not agree with me, but I don't care. Fritz Kreisler, a great friend of Einstein's, both in Berlin and later in the US. This is a picture of them in the US. That's Einstein's wife, Einstein, Fritz Kreisler, and this is Carroll someone or other, who was one of these child film stars of the era. So this was an autographed thing that she sent to both Einstein and Kreisler. So this was a concert that Kreisler gave, I think, in New York. So on his visits to the United States, he became well acquainted with Charlie Chaplin, and they became great friends. He met Chaplin when he was at Caltech, Einstein that is, and he often played with Chaplin. Chaplin himself was a very distinguished musician. This photograph is of them at the premiere of City Lights in 1931. So Chaplin wrote in his autobiography, which is astonishingly unreliable, But nevertheless, I think that these sort of recollections are correct, if not that the dates are wrong, but the recollections are correct. So he wrote that Einstein warned me that he was bringing 3 musicians to dinner. "We're going to play for you after dinner," he said. That evening, Einstein was one of a Mozart quartet. Although his bowing was not too assured and his technique a little stiff, nevertheless he played rapturously, closing his eyes and swaying. The 3 musicians, who did not show too much enthusiasm for the professor's participation, discreetly suggested giving him a rest and playing something on their own. He acquiesced and sat with the rest of us and listened, but after a while, and they'd played several pieces, he turned and whispered to me, "When do I play again?" When the musicians left, Mrs. Einstein, slightly indignant, assured her husband, "You played better than all of them." This is Charlie Chaplin with the violin. You may notice something odd. Chaplin played wrong-handedly. This is a great mystery to me. I've never been able to find an explanation of why he played the wrong hand. He also played the cello, also the wrong way around. Normally when people play these things the wrong way around, it's because they've got some injury on their left hand, which means they can't finger properly. But Chaplin had no injury. He just learned to play that way. It's astonishing. And the violin is not a symmetrical instrument, I warn you. It's very difficult to make a violin sound good if you string it the wrong way around. So he was a professor in Berlin. This is him playing in a string quartet on a crossing the Atlantic sometime in the 1930s, 1933 on the SS Deutschland. And this is a famous event in which Einstein was in the audience, in which Yehudi Menuhin played in the Berlin Philharmonic with Bruno Walter. He played the Bach, Beethoven and Brahms concertos in one concert. Astonishing thing that would never happen today. Einstein was so moved by Menuhin's playing that he rushed into the boy's room after the performance and took him in his arms, exclaiming, "My dear little boy, it is many years since I have had a privilege of receiving a lesson such as you have taught me tonight." Another version of that speech says he said something along the lines of, "And now I know that there is a God in heaven." Anyway, he thought Menuhin was a wonderful player, as indeed he was in those days. It's an in-joke. So this is Einstein playing the piano. He astonishingly often said that he couldn't play sheet music from the piano because he couldn't read music. Of course, he could read violin music, so I assume what he meant was he didn't know bass clef. And he never learnt, so he never played music from the piano, he just improvised. But he was quite a good pianist from that point of view. He could play, sort of parodies of Chopin and things like that. And he used to play, especially when he stopped playing the violin towards the end of his life, he would play the piano very regularly. This is a picture of him giving a concert in a synagogue, one of his few ventures into a synagogue. He once was invited to a synagogue in the late 1940s, and he wrote back to the rabbi saying, "Thank you for your invitation. I think if I went to a synagogue, God would not recognize me, and if he did, it would not be good for me." But this is him playing in a Berlin synagogue with Professor Landowski. They played again his favorite Bach double concerto, accompanied by the organ, which must have been a bit interesting. And here is Landowski. His face, if you can see it well, is a picture. I don't know whether he was so surprised by Einstein's playing, but anyway, they played the Bach double. And then finally he arrived in Princeton. This is a picture of him playing string quartets at his home in Princeton. He loved to play with great musicians. This is Tosca Seidel, who was a very, very famous violinist. Not so well known today, but very famous in his day in the 1930s and 40s in the US. And with 2 other professionals, not so well known, what's their name? Griskin is the cellist, and the violist is Occo. That's his secretary, with whom he wasn't in love. And that's his wife Elsa, and this is a guy called Emil Hilb, who comes into the story in the next slide, who was a sort of jobbing conductor who worked in Hollywood and latched on to Einstein and provided sort of all sorts of things like German sausages for them when they were in the US. So he organized a concert for charity to try and get German Jews out of Germany in 1934, and Einstein was the star. And here is the program and the participants. So the Bach double concerto, Harriet Cohen, who's a fascinating pianist, had affairs with almost as many people as Einstein. All the great composers of the day she had affairs with. Anyway, so she played Bach, and then they finished with a string quartet by Mozart. So this was a very well-known concert, and it raised a large sum of money for the German refugees. It unfortunately wasn't recorded, but the reviews said Einstein played, really quite well. Another great violinist who Einstein knew well is shown here. This is Huberman. Huberman, whose recording of the Brahms concerto is one of my favorites, was a remarkable man. He single-handedly founded what became the Israel Philharmonic, and in doing so saved the lives of hundreds of musicians from occupied Europe, who he auditioned blind so he wouldn't be swayed by the fact that he probably knew them, and then recruited to move to Israel and thereby saved their lives. Einstein was also very strongly involved in that movement, and here is Einstein playing in Princeton. He was also friends with many composers. Often those composers wanted to be closer to him than he wanted to be to them. This is Leopold Godowsky, who Einstein was very fond of, who was a pianist and composer. On the right is Schoenberg, with whom Einstein was not so friendly. He once said that Schoenberg was barking mad, because he didn't really care for modern music. But Schoenberg persisted and kept on writing Einstein letters, which Einstein typically didn't reply to. But this was actually a photograph taken on Schoenberg's first visit, and only visit, as far as I know, to Carnegie Hall, which is pretty amazing. He never went again. Also famous musicians with whom Einstein played, Gregor Piatowski, one of the greatest cellists of the period, and of course Jascha Heifetz, arguably the greatest violinist of the 20th century. Arguably. On his vacations, he also took his violin. He never stopped playing the violin until he became very old. This is him playing on Long Island in 1939, where he met two exiles from the UK, Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears, and they played together in the home of a shopkeeper on Long Island. I don't know quite what they played, because Britten was a very good violist, so presumably he played in a string quartet with Einstein. I'm not quite sure what Pears, he probably played the piano, I guess, but I'm not sure. Anyway, they played together. And this is one of the last photographs of Einstein playing in a group in Princeton. He's playing there in some Baroque gathering in Princeton. But even after he stopped playing, which he did in about 1948, because he felt that he wasn't making a sound he could bear any longer, I know how he feels, then he still had musical events in his house afterwards, and an old friend of mine, Paul Kent, who is now sadly dead, was a chemist, and he took part in these music-making evenings in Einstein's house in Mercer Street in 1949, when he was a postdoc in Princeton. So we're coming to the end. You'll be pleased to hear of our little resume of Einstein's career. So what we're going to do now is play for you, well, I'm not going to play, fortunately for you. My colleagues are going to play the last thing which is recorded that Einstein played. In 1948, Robert Mann, who was the first violinist of the Juilliard Quartet, they were playing a concert in Princeton, and then they went to Einstein's house to play some music for him privately. They played some things including starting off with Beethoven and then Bartók. And Mann, who was very naive, said that actually Einstein left the room when they were playing Bartók in order to concentrate better on the music. In fact, he couldn't stand Bartók and left the room for other reasons. But they ended up by playing Mozart, and then they invited Einstein to join them. He hadn't played for several years. He didn't have a violin, but they'd cunningly brought with them a violin, and he played it with them. And my colleagues will play for you now the first movement only of Mozart's G minor string quintet. And I'll leave you on the board with something which hopefully you can mostly read, which is the report that Robert Mann made of that event with Einstein playing. And then there's a little advert at the end for a certain book which you might like to read.